Hi, I'm Dr. Chris Brown. I am the host of the Disability Sport Info podcast. I'm an expert in disability sport and the Paralympic Games. This is the story about the Paralympic Games, the world's second largest multi-sport event. In this video, we will consider how the Paralympics went from 16 athletes in 1948 to 4,400 athletes in 2024. We'll consider the challenges facing the Paralympic Games and also the future direction of the Paralympics. The foundation for the Paralympic Games began in 1948 at Stoke Mandeville Hospital in England. Dr. Ludwig Guttmann, a German neurologist at Stoke Mandeville, is considered the father of the Paralympic movement. Dr. Guttmann was in charge of the spinal injuries unit, treating injured ex-servicemen and women. Guttmann felt sport could physically and mentally rehabilitate soldiers with spinal cord injuries. And so, on 28th of July 1948, 16 paralysed British ex-servicemen and women took part in an archery competition on the lawns of Stoke Mandeville Hospital. This was the first building block for the development of what we know as the Paralympic Games. The 1960 Games in Rome are viewed as the first official Paralympic Games. Before 1960, the event took place at Stoke Mandeville in England, and only ex-injured servicemen and women took part. What made 1960 special was twofold. The Paralympics were staged away from Stoke Mandeville for the first time, and it was the first time athletes with a spinal cord injury who were not ex-soldiers competed. The Paralympics had started to expand and develop. Before we go any further, we need to pause and consider why the term Paralympic Games is used. This helps us to understand the development of the event. The original meaning of the Paralympic Games, first used in 1964, referred to the Paraplegic Olympics. This was because only athletes with a spinal cord injury competed at the Paralympics. The link with the Olympics had been a deliberate tactic to help market and promote the Paralympics. Officially, the International Olympic Committee endorsed the term Paralympic Games for the 1988 Games. From 1988 onwards, Paralympic has referred to parallel as in the Parallel Games. More on the importance of the 1988 Paralympics shortly. Let's go back to consider why the term Paraplegic Olympics no longer made sense. The use of Paralympics to mean Paraplegic Olympics lost its meaning in 1976. This was when the Paralympics included amputee and visually impaired athletes. The term Paraplegic Olympics, therefore, did not represent the athletes competing. Further expansion in the type of athletes competing took place. In 1980, athletes with cerebral palsy became eligible. Athletes with a range of other physical impairments, known as the others, took part in 1984. Intellectually disabled athletes were included in the 1996 Paralympics. Before we consider the 1988 Paralympics, we need to discuss the relationship between deaf athletes and the Paralympics. Deafness on its own is not an eligible impairment category at the Paralympics. Deaf athletes compete in their own sporting competition, Deaflympics, a competition that predates the Paralympics. Now back to the 1988 Paralympics. I mentioned this was an important event. Here's why. 1988 is widely acknowledged as the birth of the modern Paralympic Games. First, this was when the term Paralympic Games assumed its contemporary meaning of parallel games. Second, and perhaps most importantly, 1988 was the first Paralympics since 1964 to be staged in the same city as the Olympics. From 1968 until 1984, the Paralympics were not held in the same location as the Olympics. This changed in 1988 and has remained since. It represented a closer alignment between the Olympic movements and the Paralympic movement. In 2001, a contractual agreement known as One Bid, One City was agreed between the two movements. This agreement legally compelled Olympic hosts to also stage the Paralympics. The closer alignment between the Paralympics and the Olympics has had a profound impact on the scale of the event. In 1988, 3,042 athletes from 60 countries took part. In 2024, approximately 4,400 athletes from 167 country delegations will take part. In addition, a refugee team and neutral athletes from Belarus and Russia will compete. The 2024 Paralympics are expected to attract a cumulative TV audience of 4.25 billion people. The scale of the Paralympics in 2024 would not have been possible without the close working relationship between the Paralympics and the Olympics. Challenges for the Paralympic movement have and continue to exist. Let's consider some of them now before we ponder the future of the Paralympics. Underrepresentation of female athletes remains a problem. 45% of athletes at the 2024 Paralympics are female, the highest ever. But this is still less than the desired 50%. Underrepresentation is not limited to gender. Athletes from countries with moderate to high social inequality are significantly underrepresented. Technology such as racing wheelchairs and running blades to support athletes can be too costly for athletes from poorer nations, distorting the competition and fairness of competition. Let's consider classification in a bit more detail due to its importance. Classification determines whether athletes can compete and who they can compete against. Classification is based on how the athlete's impairments influence their ability to compete in a sport. Classification is based on technical and scientific knowledge. It's important to understand that classification is not fixed. Athletes can be determined eligible in one Paralympics and ineligible at another. Effectively, some athletes can be retired out of their sport due to a change in classification rules. Some believe that athletes attempt to game the system. That is, some athletes exaggerate the level of their impairment. This is done to gain an unfair advantage by competing against athletes with more severe impairments than their own. The International Paralympic Committee disputes these claims. Nevertheless, classification remains a challenge. Perhaps the most high-profile classification scandal relates to intellectual disability. At the Sydney 2000 Paralympics, instances of athletes faking having an intellectual disability were uncovered. The most famous example of this was the gold-winning Spanish men's basketball team. 10 of the 12 athletes on the gold-winning team faked having intellectual disability. This led to the exclusion of intellectual disability from the Paralympic programme. Intellectually disabled athletes only returned as an eligible impairment category at the London 2012 Paralympics. Let's now consider the future of the Paralympics. We've considered the development and challenges, but what lies ahead for the Paralympics? Some argue that the Paralympics should not exist. Instead, the Olympics should include disabled athletes within their programme. After all, excluding individuals based on their disability is illegal in most other environments. Furthermore, it is argued that the Paralympics following the Olympics promotes a sense of diminished importance compared to the Olympic Games. Those in favour of maintaining the Paralympics as a unique event disagree. At current sizes, merging the Paralympics and Olympics together is unpragmatic and unfeasible. The event would be too costly and too big. The availability of medal events for athletes with severe impairments may be threatened. Some argue there is already a streamlining of events for athletes with severe impairments. A process, some argue, would accelerate if the Paralympics merged with the Olympic Games. Finally, some argue the Paralympics should be its own event to represent the pinnacle of disability sport. Rather than being viewed in a lesser light than the Olympics, the Paralympics as its own event provides a showcase for disabled athletes. For now, the Paralympics and Olympics will continue to be hosted in the same city until at least 2032. The future of the Paralympics is secure. But that does not mean those challenges I mentioned have gone away. The Paralympics need to address the challenges it faces. How the Paralympic movement responds to its challenges will determine the next chapter in this fascinating story.